All right, let's get started. My name is Angela Hansen. I'm with the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, and I'm going to be the MC for this panel this morning, in which we will talk about exploring innovation portfolio approaches. So there's been a lot of discussion about this topic lately, and very happy to have our panelists on today to dig in for the next hour and a half. Next slide, please. Just as a note, we are recording the session today, and we will make it available afterward. You're very welcome after the panelists provide their perspectives on portfolio approaches to use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions or to upvote questions. We will be taking questions directly from that. And the slides will be made available afterward in an email to all participants. Next slide. And the team kind of behind the scenes today, well, not behind the scenes at the very moment, but this is the four OPSI members who are working on this portfolio assessment tool that you'll hear about and running and hosting this webinar today. So we have Pirette Tornerest, Angela Hansen, Jamie Berryhill, and Alex Roberts. Next slide. So the agenda for today is Pirette is going to give us an introduction to the topic and to frame it a bit, to kind of give a discussion about what does portfolio approach mean and what are the different ways of thinking about it. Then we'll hear from our three panelists, and then we'll have some Q&A and discussion. And finally, in the last 5 to 10 minutes, we'll do a wrap up and the next steps. Next slide. So can you back up, please? To introduce our panelists today, we have Pirette Tornerest from the OECD, who is a project manager of the Systems Thinking and Anticipatory Innovation Governance work streams. We have Dan Hill, Strategic Director of Design at Vinnovera, Emma Joy, Strategic Advisor at Climate Kick, and Mikael Seppälä, who is a Community Specialist at Sitra Lab. So to get us started and to frame this topic, Pirette, handing it over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and good evening to those in other time zones. It is great to be here and talk about the innovation portfolios and what they are. So a little bit about the background why we at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation even started to think about the innovation portfolios. The usual context is that in general, also in policy, not only in innovation projects, we have a lot of different projects and programs in function in governments. So we tend to have a kind of layered approach to policy. So we don't kind of have a systematic approach to policy design, nor do we have a systematic approach to innovation itself. So these are the findings that we have had seen from OECD countries and elsewhere when we have looked at innovation systems, but also looked at policy design in general, because there's a kind of an understanding that policies tend to be layered on top of each other. And it's usually the same way with innovation as well, that innovation policies or innovation projects within the public sector also get layered in on top of each other. So we don't tend to actually look at all of these different things together and see what is actually coming out of this. So what is coming out of the efforts of innovation and innovation projects that we are actually want to see happen within the public sector context itself. And one of the fundamental things that we also have been trying to introduce in the public sector as well is that there are different types of innovation. So innovation is not the same. There are different innovation activities within the public sector in its entirety, and they live in parallel to each other or in synergies with each other. But it's also very difficult to see how they get along with each other. So that's why we need to have a bit of a more of a portfolio approach. And where we, at least at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, start with our portfolio thinking is the purpose of innovation. So why do we innovate in the first place in the public sector? So we want to do things better in the public sector. We want to capture emerging possibilities that fundamentally may change how we do things. So we are in one of these possibilities in the crisis at the moment that is fundamentally really shaping how we do things and what we do in its entirety. In the public sector as well, we want to achieve things. We want to solve problems. And that's why we need innovation within the public sector. But also environmental changes and evolving situations in technology or in society might also require public sectors to innovate. And all of these different goals are essentially part of innovation portfolios. So you have an innovation portfolio, whether it's intentional or not, because public sector essentially wants to solve these 4 quintessential questions. It's constantly innovating towards these essential questions. Thus, public sectors, if they think about it or don't think about it, they also have a mixture of mission-oriented, enhancement-oriented, adaptive and anticipatory innovation projects and programs. So these different things that scope these questions that I talked about before. And we really want to have a kind of an understanding how to actually manage those portfolios in an effective and systemic way. So look at all of these innovations together and also say how public sector organizations can be effective in managing innovation portfolios that have these different aims. So you cannot manage mission-oriented innovation same way as you would do adaptive innovation, or you would do anticipatory innovation and enhancement-oriented innovation. So there are different things within our organizations and goals that also drive different types of innovation. So if we want to have a kind of balanced portfolio or different approaches to innovation, then we have to actually start thinking about how we do that and how we manage those portfolios effectively. So the question is, can different innovations actually get along? So can they exist within the same portfolio in an effective manner? So is portfolio management in its entirety to just look at different projects, so juggling different projects from one project to another, so that we have an anticipatory project and we have an adaptive project or enhancement-oriented innovation projects, and how do we get synergies in between? So going from one way or to another. But also maybe it's all a big mess. So I hope you excuse my circus analogy that I'm going to take a little bit further through this, this talk as well, because probably I'm missing a little bit of entertainment during this homestay. But sometimes there are so many different things going on in the public sector and also in innovation projects, it is difficult to actually kind of have an overview of all the different things that are going on and how they fit together. So it's not even about the effects of innovation projects, and projects in general are not only about juggling the different projects, but also the impacts of those projects start to intermingle, start to change, and are very difficult to grasp. So how to do innovation portfolio management? So our initial analysis actually has shown different components about how portfolio management in the public sector or in the private sector context is done. So we see different components from sense-making, stewardship, supportive structures to portfolios, different purposes to portfolios, finding synergies, resourcing, monitoring, evaluating, from learning to communication. So all of these different things that different portfolio approaches seem to do. And yet, when we actually go deeper into the portfolio approaches, they tend to be at the kind of the starting point. So most portfolio approaches tend to look only at the kind of the initial sense-making and stewardship of portfolios. So they look at how to actually make sense of the projects that are in the portfolios and the initial steps to how to steward those projects. But little attention is actually given to what type of institutions or organizational supporting structures, evaluation structures, monitoring these different types of innovations actually need to function in an ongoing basis. So we also think that portfolio management should be all of those different things. The question is how to do it well. So how to actually manage the innovation portfolio as well. So for that reason, we are actually in the process of building a portfolio assessment tool, so innovation portfolio assessment tool for public sector organizations. So this is not for all of government, but it's specifically we're looking at the organizational level, because usually there is where the kind of the innovation processes tend to, at least at now, start where the roles start for portfolios themselves. So who are we? We have identified some people and some users who would need a kind of a portfolio assessment tool or kind of understanding of innovation portfolios in its entirety. So we have been looking into the kind of the profiles of lone wolf innovators who actually want to understand what kind of innovation portfolio their organizations have. So what does innovation or innovation have it in its entirety? So I can personally also tell that I have an overview of projects and innovation projects within the OECD, but I'm certain that I don't have a full view of all the different magical things the OECD is doing at the same time, all of which might be actually interesting to me, and some of the activities the Observatory Public Sector Innovation is actually doing. So the portfolio assessment tool, if applied well, could be a kind of a conversation starter and a curiosity driver of kind of innovation activities within the public sector organizations in its entirety. So used by these kind of lone wolf innovators within their own context to actually drive a more systemic discussion around public sector innovation portfolios in their organizations. So take it to the leadership or the innovation communities or otherwise. Then we're also looking at the kind of the forward-looking teams on innovation labs and others who might be interested in actually making a case for innovation or need for innovation within their organizations as well. So legitimize the process and maybe also look at specifically their own innovation portfolios and how to manage them, and how their innovation portfolios are shaped by the organizational structures that they're in. So how the organization is actually influencing or limiting their ability to innovate in its entirety. And last but not least, we are also want to look at the role or the interest of central organizations and senior advisors and the kind of the traditional stewards of policy portfolios that also might be interested in having a kind of a systemic look at the innovation portfolios, to have a snapshot of how the organization is actually doing and have the building blocks to build strategies towards public sector innovation portfolios as well. So these are the kind of the people that we are, the groups of interest that we are interested in engaging with this discussion. And for that, we're actually trying to build different types of modules of public sector innovation portfolio assessment. So the first module would be an experience-based module based on organizational experiences. So that to generate very specific heat maps of how organizations are actually shaping innovation portfolios, or how they potentially are shaping innovation portfolios. And then come back to the kind of the circus analogy. It would be a kind of a contortionist act, that you would have actually organizations that have different tools and methods that they apply, different organizational cultures and rules and procurement procedures and other processes, and leadership and rewards and incentives that actually reward certain type of innovation and discourage other types of innovation. So the first module that we want to engage with is actually to engage with the contortionist act, to say, well, how does your organization in its entirety affect these 4 different types of innovation that we have I was talking about before? So how does your organization with its structures supports missions, supports enhancement-oriented innovation, supports anticipatory innovation, supports other types of innovation in its entirety? So do a bit of an assessment of the organization and how it affects innovation portfolios to begin with. So to have a kind of an assessment tool online for organizations for that. The second module that we're planning to do for the portfolio assessment tool is connected to project-based assessment of how the actually different innovation projects land on these different types of innovations and how they are kind of valued within the organization itself. So to have a kind of a look at how different types of innovation projects fit together and which purposes they actually serve. And this is the kind of the standard understanding of innovation portfolios that we are looking at project-specific outputs. But this is also very important, as I said before, that a lot of the approaches within the public sector are layered on top of each other and not always analyzed in terms of their kind of common outcome. And coming back to the circus, I mean, the trapeze act, it would be very scary to be one of the below people or trapezeists in the configuration if you couldn't actually, rely on the people above. So the question is, what kind of synergies and approaches these different projects actually bring together? So if we have missions, for example, that are very specific to our organization, can we look at these different effects of these projects that we have, or innovation projects towards missions, and their joint effects towards the goals that we want to achieve? So do we actually have enough projects and enough effort and enough resources within our organization to actually reach the goals that we want to reach? And the same goes for kind of anticipatory action and adaptation and enhancement-oriented projects itself. So it requires a kind of systemic analysis about what is going on within the organizations themselves. So our aim, at least, our initial thinking is to have a kind of not a heat map, but also a layered approach to different projects and their significance within the kind of innovation portfolio within the organization itself. Quick snapshot or a conversation starter about how much resources or money we're actually investing in different projects and how do we value it in the broader innovation portfolio of organizations. And last but not least, we are also planning a kind of a very close look at the organizations themselves. So looking at very specifically about specific organizations to do an analysis on overall how different individuals perceive and interact with the innovation portfolio and how their perceptions about the innovation portfolio change based on their roles. So do a full analysis of the organization and the innovation portfolios. And this is our module 3. And this would be the circus analysis, to have a full picture of all of these different things acting together within a single organization and their goals for innovation in its entirety. So we need help for that. So we have launched a testing approach at the moment at the OECD, where, to be honest, we have testing at the moment some questions connected to module 1. So module 1 has questions connected to specific questions connected to organizational structures, from procurement to leadership to tools and method organizations use and how they load or influence different types of innovations. And also some of the questions that we have put together connected to good portfolio management, or what we think are characteristics of the ability for organizations to actually manage or innovation portfolios in an effective manner. These are the kind of the questions that we have at the moment are testing with different counterparts. And thankfully, I've had very great people from the public sector organizations already sending in their replies. So we have had hypothetical organizations, experts from the private sector and universities who are pretending in some cases to work for digital units of government, or actually people working in digital units doing the questionnaire based on their own experience. So this is a great help that we have open, and the usability testing is open until the end of this month. So if you want to kind of have a 20 to 30 minutes to spare on your free time, then we would really appreciate the help in testing some of these questions. And now I will give it over to Angela to put forward other aspects of the portfolio, innovation portfolio management.
Yes, thank you, Pirette. There's more than one way to look at innovation portfolios, and this thinking of ours is in its early stages. And we're very happy today to have 3 panelists who are looking at innovation portfolios as well from different perspectives. So we have a kind of within government perspective at Vinnovera. Mikkel is bringing kind of a government adjacent perspective, and then Emma's looking at kind of an ecosystem perspective, ecosystem of actors around a specific mission. So we want to compare, contrast, and learn from these different approaches. So first we'll hear from Dan, and then we'll hear from Emma, and then we'll hear from Mikkel on how they're thinking about innovation portfolios. So Dan, would you kick off by sharing your screen and talking a little bit with us about how you think about innovation portfolios?
Sure. Can you see that?
Yes.
Good. And you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. And you might hear some birds in the background, which I don't apologize for because they're nicer to listen to than I am. So bonus. So I'm gonna rattle through this. Apologies in advance for moving at speed. And apologies for all these P words to begin with, because when we're talking about portfolios, I'm also thinking about platforms and participation and places and politics and process and so on. And they all sort of mix together. I'll try and pick out the differences. Just briefly, Vinnovera is the Swedish government innovation agency. So we're a government agency. And I'm the director of strategic design there. You can tell by my accent, I'm actually English. I've been here about a year or so. So I'm still figuring the place out, as I probably will be in about 10 years as well, but anyway. And I've been leading our mission-oriented innovation work and helping figure out what kind of new tools and processes we need. So I'm going to talk about portfolios at the agency level a little bit, and then portfolios at missions in particular, because we've been looking at mission-oriented innovation. And then also portfolios at places, like on the ground, what's happening there. And just to sort of get the stuff about missions out of the way in a way, there's a key thing about missions that is often neglected, I think, that it's not really about target setting and then everything else just follows. It's actually more about the doing in our book anyway. We have lots of targets already. We have all these UN SDGs, we have Paris 1.5, we have numerous targets at the national level. So in a way, we don't need any more of those. We already have to deliver this lot within the next 10 years. So we're focusing a bit more on the action, as in how do you actually achieve things, which means, for instance, collapsing policy and delivery together very tightly, because it's not, again, a case of setting a target and then just emailing that at the country and then everything responds. It's actually about how do we change the way that we do delivery and then build policy around that. So we're kind of closing those things very tightly. And that's based a little bit on my experience. I'm also at UCL IIPP working with Mariana Mazzucato and others. And we worked together on the mission-oriented industrial strategy in the UK, which was a really good instructive process and a very useful piece of work for the government, I think, before other things distracted them. But was rather top-down in a way, not in a bad way. I just think that's the way that it was perceived at the time. Ministers and academics and people like me, we didn't really get out of the room, if you like. So when we came to Sweden, we wanted to do the opposite and kind of get down to the ground. So we very quickly pulled together a portfolio, actually. And this is what it was a year ago. This is now being superseded and is long gone. But this is my draft kind of first thinking about a mission portfolio. The yellow things being the missions, as in things with clear societal outcomes, affordable, sustainable neighborhoods, healthy, sustainable food, the very strong societal benefits you can see. And then the blue things are these enablers. How do you make that happen? Governments often confuse those two, I would say. You know, you have a mission around AI, and that's pointless, basically, because AI isn't a thing that is an outcome, in a sense. It's an enabler of something, you know, good AI or bad AI. But AI pointed at food, that's interesting, because then you can have a conversation about what kind of food systems we want and AI's role within that. So we separated those things out quite a lot, looked at the relationship between the outcomes and these enablers, and that's informed the way that we're now rebuilding a bit of the agency, at least. And so again, the kind of missions are these sort of things with inspirational relevance and direction and so on, but perhaps more importantly, they're about aligning top-down and bottom-up activities, cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral, multi-level relationships. So we set out on a process of learning, to be honest, because there is no playbook for missions really in detail in terms of designing on the ground. So we decided to start making one as we went. And given the complexity of the situation we're in, we wanted to create a learning system. So we've engaged very closely. This is roughly the kind of process of that. Portfolios start emerging right from day one in a way, because when we start developing these angles, which we do in a very participative co-design way, we've worked with 500 or 600 different organizations over about 6 or 7 months in Sweden to figure out the angles on systems around which you could build missions and then building prototypes. All of that is beginning to develop portfolio thinking about aligning things with a direction, multiple types of activities. And we did that with the system, if you like. So we ran numerous workshops like this where we're building what we call these systems canvases. This is an actors workshop. So these are people on the ground delivering systems, public transports, or the startups, or the large corporations, or the government agencies very close to delivery, working together to build these relatively complex, messy canvases, which we then start looking at as this kind of portfolio. I'm not bothering with the detail of these, of course, just to give you a sense of the kind of things that emerge out of this. So from this one around healthy, sustainable food systems, we get 8 or so key areas to work: zero waste circular systems, trusted produce that's traceable, healthy, resilient farming, those kinds of things. They begin to be starting points for a portfolio. We carefully stretch those out and pull them apart into push and pull, or demand side and supply side measures. So it's not just tech push supply side stuff, which is often traditionally the remit of innovation agencies, but it's also the demand side. How do you create a demand? How do you work with citizens? How do you understand the place, particular cultures, and how they might adapt things? We then started looking at these things as kind of complex systems. So, you know, breaking apart the street into all of these different elements. This, again, has come from people directly that we were working with in this co-design way. That's important because you get insight as to what to do, what can be done. You also start building a network of people that you can take with you to get things done. So actually, it's also building what Mariana calls a coalition of the willing. Not always the best illusion, but people that can actually help deliver change in these areas. Then we start looking at them in terms of system layers. So we have, let's say, a place on the ground as a demonstrator, a systems demonstrator. We talk about a place to deliver into. And then underneath, we understand what are the common systemic layers that can actually run across the whole country, across multiple places. So this is our portfolio emerging at the level of mission now. How do you break apart a set of actions and interventions into this combination of very specific things and very general things? Because the general things enable you to scale it across an entire country or system. That's very similar to the way that smartphones work or the internet works effectively, where you can have lots of diversity at the high level in terms of apps and users. Pirette will have, you know, Super Mario Brothers on her phone, and Angela might have LinkedIn. That's fine, but they both sit on very consistent stacks underneath the ground, if you like, and that enables you to have this consistency and specificity simultaneously. So just a note on portfolio in question here, that, you know, does portfolio sometimes has the illusion of an investment portfolio. It's not always the case, of course. Designers have portfolios, but often in the world of agencies, we think in terms of investment, and we're actually thinking very differently. This isn't traditionally the role of the agency as an investor that then might check in every 2 years, but it's actually about engagement on the ground. Now, maybe venture capitalists also engage in a much deeper way than traditionally investors might have done. But I think there's something we need to think about the language here. And so that's why we're talking a bit more about platforms and systems and so on. So then we started looking into place-based delivery. We're looking then for these objects that you can kind of bust open. That currently we're surrounded by objects that are run in a very silo-based way, not in a portfolio, if you like. So a street is usually run by the traffic department. Streets aren't about traffic. It's just we've given them the keys to the street. They do many other things. So if we have a portfolio of actors helping change or drive what the street is, you can achieve multiple kinds of outcomes here. So this is, again, very basic thinking, but I can say actually also kind of a radical change. If you think about who is in charge of the street, ultimately we're moving to a position where citizens themselves can govern their own streets, given a kit of parts designed by all of these kinds of people. That's where we're heading with this. And I really like this quote from Milika Begovic, who talks about, in the blue bit there, how do we find these mechanisms that gradually resolve and explore uncertainties through system dynamics and learning and adaptation? That's what we're looking for here. So we're looking for these objects like streets, schools, farms, forests, around which you can approach them as complex systems. Therefore, that enables a kind of portfolio approach. So our portfolio, coming to the end now in terms of mobility, starts looking at these kinds of places that fit together at multiple scales. You can see how they might fit together as a system. There's a relationship between them all. Again, I won't go into them in detail. Same with food. This came through, again, this kind of 6-month engagement process. And then we work these through again to the next level. So again, then we pull the system into the room. Effectively, this is like a portfolio in human form. We have these people who are all representing different organizations or even high school students. as part of the design process. These are the kind of outputs of this. This is a portfolio at a street level, what actually the interventions systemically on the ground. So we end up with our missions finally, the street mission, for instance. How do we change every single street in Sweden to be healthy, sustainable, and vibrant? This is about directions, not targets as such. We have targets underneath it, but when you look at a street, there's all this stuff in here. So this is where we're now thinking about value models. So how do you drive a portfolio? These are the kind of metrics that changing a street can unlock. You see one or two of them are to do with traffic, but decreasing domestic violence is something you can do by introducing greenery into the street. There's a research which shows that. So we see this kind of system level, again, portfolio of interventions at the street level. We have design principles for understanding how to find and locate and unpack these things. We can play them out in the kind of Matsukato model on the right, if you like, or these, maybe increased definition of metrics on the left-hand side. We're building a value model to guide that at two levels, not just the interventions on the street, as in does this make the street a better place, but also how do you steer the mission in that way? And that's where we get to more complex metrics again, just say financial return or X number of startups growing. That enables you to kind of pivot your way through the project as it goes. Again, this means a lot more engagement. All of these are decision points, and use the value model to guide that. Scaling can happen in this way because we've chosen the right object. So traditionally, cities change with these urban development districts, like on the left. That's the biggest urban development project in Sweden, one of the biggest in Europe, the River City. But if you look at, actually, if we build a system to transform the streets on the right-hand side, that's all the streets in Gothenburg. It's a far bigger, more expansive thing, and that can replicate across Malmö, Stockholm, and so on. So we're finding, again, these ways of designing this. Again, I'm not going to bore you with the detail, but this is all beginning to think about how do you build a portfolio of interventions at a street level. Missions enables you to align existing projects in this way, multiple types of projects, to Perret's language, anticipatory, iterative, all of those things, enhancement oriented. They can align under the mission umbrella. Actually, that's the way we see the mission. It's not a different type of innovation. It's a way of grouping them. And we can align these different collaborators up and down this platform. This was the mobile phone analogy I showed you earlier. And here's where we are now, and this is the end. So we're now working through with design agencies. How do we start building these intervention points? These are the sketches of these systems that could basically cover every street in Sweden, ultimately, bit by bit, that enable you to then deploy technology, deploy greenery, deploy governance innovation, deploy financial innovation, genuinely transform environments. This is happening with school kids as well. They're often the best designers of streets in many ways. So this is them getting their hands dirty. This is the Prime Minister doing the same thing. I like where we have the Prime Minister and the school kids using the same design method. This is what the kids came up with. I won't show you what the Prime Minister came up with. And now ultimately we're sort of now moving this into, these are actual now proposals for change streets outside schools, which as you see, begin to see are very, very different. So back to that system model, we can begin to understand then which of these intervention points enable us to achieve change in these things in a way that can scale, that we can deploy multiple projects around, aligning existing ones, and start thinking of them as connected portfolios. And the logic really is, again, this kind of complex systems logic. Perret would know how to pronounce Ilya Prigoghiny's name better than me, but anyway, the idea of these small islands of coherence, like the street, actually can ripple through the whole system. And we need to bring that thinking into portfolios of it. We have the same thing with school food, by the way, but it's a whole separate conversation. So we're beginning to sketch out how Vinnovera changes in that way. This is, again, very draft work in progress. It's internal document, and it's already changed since this. But we're thinking, how do these high-level categories align around super high-level targets like the SDGs down to things on the ground that are missions and so on. And finally, then there's a different role for the agency here, which is actually gluing together all of these pieces, working across national, local, regional levels, public and private sector. This kind of funny pink blob is effectively the mission that we're inhabiting, and we're sort of glued. We're not really, it's not our mission. We're facilitating it and sometimes driving it, of course, and joining it up, but it's actually delivered by everybody else in a sense. So that's kind of an interesting relationship for us. So that's where I'll end it. We have the tech, we have the institutions in Sweden, at least they're fairly strong still. Maybe they need work, but still. We have targets, so basically this comes down to collaboration, about working in systems, which means prototypes, in my view. Hugely more engagement, so not being a funder that's distanced, but being a very engaged actor, and working with participation in portfolios and platforms and places. And then that is really, there's lots of new tools and activities. I don't pretend that we have even 10% of this stuff figured out, but this is where we are at the moment around the work. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Very interesting to get us to think a bit about scale and the role of different actors. Obviously, we need we could do a full, for each of our panelists, a full hour and a half just digging into the details, but thanks for giving a quick overview of that. And just as a reminder to attendees, if you have questions for our panelists as we go along, please add them into the Q&A and we will address them at the end of all three panelists. Okay, next up is Emma.
Hello, morning all. I'm just going to try and share my screen. So hopefully you can all see my screen and hear me okay. Perfect. Okay, so I have been working at Climate Kick for around 4 years now. We are a pan-European, EU-funded innovation agency, and we work with a community of around 400 organisations, partner organisations. And I mention that because when I talk about our portfolio approach and our work, I will be in the main talking about work we do with a much wider group of actors than just our own organisation. I have been working on implementing our portfolio approach since around October 2018. And so I was gonna use time this morning just to share some experiences from the implementation journey at Climate Kick, and give some of my perspective on the process and the things that I've see us learn, or I've learnt myself. But before I talk to the how, I was just going to very quickly talk about the why the portfolio approach is why we believe it's very important to our work, why it's a core piece of our strategy, and how we believe we're going to deliver on our mission. So, as I said, we are an EU-funded innovation agency. From the name, I'm sure you will have guessed that our key focus is climate, and how we are going to address the climate challenge or the climate emergency using innovation. Our position is that incremental change, backed up by lots of studies and lots of reports, incremental innovation is not going to give us the step change that we need to keep below a 2-degree climate change. And so we have, in 2019, we published a new strategy and started on the road to a quite significant strategic pivot. So this was moving from a more traditional model of grant funding, incremental, single point innovation, looking very much towards the supply side, and moving towards being much more deliberately transformative, focusing on being much more demand driven, understanding what the actual market challenges and needs are and how we should be responding to that. And also, importantly, I think, looking at how we start to apply innovation in systems and taking a systems intervention perspective on how we make change. So I give you all of that, not because I think innately that you were here to hear all about our strategy this morning, but I think that goes some way to explain why and how we are using a portfolio approach. So if we want to intervene in systems, if we want to address a very, very pressing, time-bound, urgent problem, we believe we need to be agile. We believe that we need to be able to move quickly, that we need to create a learning loop to be able to respond to what's working and what isn't, and where we should be directing our resource, our focus, our efforts. And again, the hour is a wider group than just the kind of the 270 people that we have in the organisation. I very much mean the wider community of 400 that we work with and deliver projects with. So that's a small piece of the why, and hopefully that's useful context. I think in terms of the how, for us, there's two very much interlinked, two sides of the same coin in terms of our portfolio approach. So the first piece is composition, and by that we mean making very, very deliberate choices about the work that we do, and doing that from a portfolio perspective. And so in very simplistic terms, that means moving away from a process whereby we would pick innovation projects and make choices about investments and resourcing on our own focus on an activity by activity or project by project basis, and moving to a place where we're able to make decisions much more based on the sum of the whole, the interactions, the complementarity, the outlier position, the space in which any individual activity sits within a much broader portfolio of activity. So how do we make choices and how do we experiment, which gives us the best chance of making impact? Then the other side of that for us is sense making, which is the activity by which we try to understand what we are learning. So if we are undertaking activities and systems, hoping that that will force the system to change or catalyse change within a system that we need, then what is the feedback telling us and what are we learning from that external activity, and what does that mean for what we should be doing next? And how do we do that in as fleet of foot and agile a way, given the challenge that we want to be part of addressing? I think the other thing to say is that I think for us, our portfolio approach is a way for us to operate in high levels of uncertainty. And I think there's a piece around us, around a portfolio approach, giving us a spread of options that help us respond to a challenge where we do not, we have huge levels of uncertainty that we deal with, and we are never going to be in a position where we have all of the information that we would like to have to base our decisions upon. So a little bit in terms of some of the ways that we think about the portfolio and how we make choices. I think in terms of innovation, it might just be useful to point out that we definitely do think about the diversity of what we do. We work across large and multiple systems, which are all interconnected and are themselves systems of systems. And we do think about innovation and the balance of innovation across our portfolio in terms of the intervention mechanism or type. So not just a focus on technology, there is innovation around business models, citizen engagement, production, policy, finance, that are equally important and need to be brought to bear against the problem that we are seeking to address. I would say also that we apply our portfolio approach across a range of different scales. So we apply the portfolio approach in terms of how we sense make and how we make choices about what we do at the whole organisation level. And then there are also projects that are using a portfolio approach to think about their portfolio of activity at a project or programme or activity or funder level. So just some other examples of the kind of questions we ask ourselves when thinking about what we should be doing. Think about spread, diversity, scale, speed to impact, connectivity at the portfolio level, as well as trying to understand the merits and the structure of the project or activity that we're considering. So just really quickly, I thought I would flag a couple of things that we have been applying or things that I maybe have noticed about what we've done. The first one is that we use collective intelligence, both in our composition sessions and also in our sense making. So we, when we make decisions on reviewing our existing portfolio, or when we make decisions about options for new activity that we could be funding, undertaking, co-designing, working with others on, we have chosen a model which very much moves us away from a group of the usual expected senior management or a group of experts in a particular area in the organisation that will make those decisions. And we have moved to a consensus model of decisions where we bring forward a whole range of different colleagues from different parts of the organisation with different levels of, with different areas of expertise and different perspectives, and use the kind of the collective group wisdom to come to our decisions. And we hope to start to come up with, to address kind of some of the inherent bias in how we work, to make sure that we are harnessing, you know, much broader perspectives. And I think for us in addressing climate change, that's particularly helpful because there isn't a single market, there isn't a single system, and there isn't a kind of a simple supply chain that we are working with. So there are multiples of all of those, and there is great complexity in some of the areas that we are trying to work in. So I think the breadth of perspectives that we bring to bear has pushed people out of their comfort zone and has been challenging, but has also been a really useful and kind of fruitful change to how we've worked. I think in line with that, expertise is only one input. So I think we've done a lot of work within that collective decision-making move to decouple somebody who is the voice of one particular expertise as being the only voice of expertise that we need to hear from. And again, because we're trying to work within complexity and work in complex systems, it's really important that we are really much more open-minded and broad in our thinking about who actually has expertise that should be brought to bear on a decision or a problem. One of our other learnings, or one of the other changes to our thought processes that I think has been enabled and kind of demanded by moving to a portfolio approach, is why a good project isn't enough. So we have found ourselves in positions where we are making decisions about what we do, and actually an excellently structured project which is crafted incredibly well in terms of its budgets and its work packages and its thinking and its intent may not be enough for us to say yes to it, because we are trying to move to a place where we are applying a much broader portfolio approach. So the project in and of itself on its own merits may be good, but it still may not be a choice that we make in terms of it being an activity that we move forward with if it doesn't provide sufficient answers to the questions around portfolio that we would be asking of it. So it's fit, it's complementarity, it's an outlier, it fills a gap, a whole range of different interdependencies with what we're trying to achieve and what we're already undertaking. And then my final points that I wanted to share were just that it starting to implement the portfolio approach to our organisation, changed much more than we expected. And I think what's been quite interesting is seeing that implementation actually amount to quite a significant organisational change, and in some ways being a change management process. And that it has changed, definitely it has shifted behaviours. It has been an agent of change within the organisation in and of itself, as well as hopefully being an agent of change out in the world through what we decide to undertake and work on. I've already said it pushes people out of their comfort zone, and it certainly does, I think. But I think then you also, I think when people are pushed out of their comfort zone, they're hopefully not too far outside, and therefore they are learning, and it definitely has brought a shift in behaviours and culture. It's also changed a lot of our business as usual processes. It has changed systems and steps that we take in order to be able to support this way of working. So I think there's definitely been quite a broad ripple effect across the organisation in a whole range of areas in terms of change that it's brought about. So it's been an interesting journey so far, but not one we're finished. Lots to learn, lots more to do.
Great. Thank you, Emma. Very interesting to see a bit behind the scenes at Climate Kick. And to round us up from the panel, one quick note, if you have questions for any of the panelists, please add them to the Q&A and or upvote the questions that you see in the list. So we'll start from the top when we get to the question, the Q&A part of this webinar. Okay, so our last panelist, before we get into that, is Mikkel. Mikkel, go ahead.
Yeah, hi all. Thanks for inviting me to join the panel. I'm Mikael Seppälä from Sitra, the Finnish Futures Fund. And in comparison to what Emma and Dan were speaking, we're very much in the first steps towards this type of new way of operating with the innovation portfolios. And we've been focusing on the sense-making parts and how to manage the portfolio around that. And one thing to note is that we, in Sitra Lab, we seek to facilitate the development of changemakers' skills and attitudes and opportunities to solve wicked problems, meaning we're not doing this type of practice too much, but we're supporting other organizations and also also Sitra internally in building their capacities around that. And what we've been doing this year, we've organized a international workshop around this whole topic. This whole topic of innovation portfolio management is pretty new. So if you're looking to read a book about the topic, you probably won't find anything related to it. So it's more about bringing the right people together and starting to build a picture of what's happening, what we should be doing together. And we've been working. We organized an international workshop with the UNDP. That is pretty far with this, and Emma's Climate Kick Narrate, which is part of the Cognitive Edge Network, and Cora Foundation, which is consulting on UNDP's and Climate Kick's approaches. And in Finland, we've been working with this innovation portfolio network comprising of about 20 organizations, and we've been hosting four workshops and supporting organizations in developing different type of experiments that might help them show the value of this approach. And we're currently working on a publication on the approach to help build this whole field and help build this approach. The big question that we're facing globally, Dan was showing all of those SDG targets and all of the other stuff, is that we're in this situation globally that we really need systems change, not rather than climate change, but maybe just only being in the streets is not enough for us. And the problem that we're facing is that we can't really Google answers to wicked problems. There are different type of problem category which requires different type of approaches that our traditional approaches to management necessarily are not able to accommodate to. So there are multiple stakeholders, constant change, and multiple scales and perspectives that are related to these wicked problems. And we've been doing some comparison of these different portfolio types. Strategic portfolio management, it's nothing new. Most bigger organizations do that to execute their strategies through different type of programs and projects. But the difference from that to this innovation portfolio sense making and management that UNDP and Climate Kick and other organizations are taking forward is that we actually should start shifting our focus from this type of organization-centric, team-based approaches into actually collaborating to foster transformation in the world. And the types of problems that these innovation portfolios are able to handle are these open and broad problems like climate change, rather than maybe the reducible and narrow problems. And the relationship between the problems and solutions would be that previously you could actually define the problems and solutions, but now you have to bring together an ecosystem to do experiments, to start exploring the different type of approaches. So this means that projects are no longer planned means of executing solutions, but rather experimental means of learning about and about and how to tackle the problems. And this time span perspective is also really interesting. So traditionally, when we work on a project proposal, we make a plan and then we say that we're going to be doing this in 2 years. But when you start framing the portfolio from this transformation perspective, you actually have to start thinking about the time span needed to achieve the transformation and use that to inform the different projects and budgets and planning cycles. Like I was saying, we've been building our understanding of innovation portfolio sense making and management on the shoulders of UNDP and Climate Kick and Cora Foundation, and generally what we've learned is that building these capabilities related to these might require you to integrate three type of approaches. So this sense making and intelligence practices, which are more about learning and adapting over projects. So bringing different projects together and seeing how you might learn over those. Portfolio composition, I think Emma was talking about that. So it's not enough for single projects to be awesome, but you actually want projects that have synergies with each other, so that they have more impact. And an area that is still maybe in the works in many places is how do you actually start designing the impact of the portfolio, and how do you use visualization techniques to approach these. And what we're doing at Sitra is actually trying to work on the first experiments to show the value of this type of approach and helping other organizations in Finland show the value of it. And so one thing to note is that if you want to develop fully fledged capabilities in these areas, it will probably take you 3 to 5 years. And we are now 5 months into our journey, which shows us what we're doing currently. So, in Sitra, what we're doing to help Sitra embed and explore these practices is that we're developing our activity model, or the way that Sitra operates, and as part of that, we're developing a shared theory of change and experimenting with portfolio visualization internally. And we're exploring sense-making practices so that we could help strengthen this internal collaboration. I think this is one part of what Climate Kick was doing in the beginning. So they first focused on building their internal capabilities in doing change in this way, and then opening it up for an external area. But so that's my really short introduction to what we're doing at Sitra. Time for questions after this.
Great, thank you so much. If there's a common thread in all of the presentations, is that we're all trying to figure it out, and we're all just getting started. That this approach is more of an art than a science at this point, and there's a lot of humility here on the panel. So with that, Pirette, if I can hand it over to you to get the discussion started. What we'll do is Pirette will ask an initial discussion question, and as attendees reflect on what you heard, please add your question to the chat. So these are questions that you want to ask the full panel or a subset of the panel that you heard from. So add it to the Q&A and upvote the questions that you want us to ask. So we'll take them from the top. So please feel free to do that now. Pirette, over to you for discussion.
Thank you so much for everybody for their very interesting presentations. And I'm going to grab onto something that Dan very intuitively and very wisely said as well, that when we talk about the innovation portfolios, we tend to think about investment portfolios. So we tend to think about resourcing. And what we also see in our work when we work together with public sector organizations ourselves in their innovation strategies and their portfolios at the OECD is that we can have a very nice discussion on missions and facilitation of different types of relationships. But when it comes down to it of actually doing the action, then all of a sudden you tend to have a lot of barriers, because our funding mechanism allows us to do this or that, or our work is in silos. So we cannot really have a good relationship with with some other people from another department who have another agenda. So my question to all the panelists based on this is, what in your organization and practice tend to shape or bias your innovation portfolio and how you work? And what are your strategies for creating space for multiple types of innovation at the same time, or making your portfolio work in practice, in action as well? And I think we can, as I mentioned, Dan, I think we can start with Dan.
Thank you. Good question. So it's also sort of Rowan Conway asked a question about bias in the Q&A, which was another good question. So I think there's sort of an implicit direction that we deal with based in a government agency, because we sit under one ministry, for instance, the Ministry of Enterprise Innovation, effectively, industry and so on. And that kind of colors the work traditionally. It sort of flavors the work quite a lot. And we've tried to retain that position whilst opening it up by working in the way that I described. So by working in this very participative, or as much as we can anyway, co-design way, including actually citizens as we go, but certainly starting with stakeholders. We didn't start with the question of, okay, who do we need to talk to in the Ministry of Industry? It was really a question of what systems are we working in, mobility and health and food and so on. How do we get as close to the ground as possible and engage with the reality of that as best as we can? I'm not pretending we did it in an amazing way. But so therefore we start the process off based around the way that, let's say, reality is organized as opposed to the way that the government is organized. We try to keep those glued together, and we can't pretend that we're not sitting under this ministry, but we actually open up. And that's meant that we've spoken to all kinds of people that we wouldn't have otherwise, and they've been very involved in shaping what happens. That's one way of opening up the process to from something that's very closed to very open, and something which reveals the seams of the project based around the reality of what we're dealing with, again, as opposed to the way we happen to be organized. So you can describe that maybe as a user-centered or people-centered. I would also argue a place-centered approach. That's one thing. The other thing we've done is there's a funny kind of bias that happens when you're a funding agency, because there's certain tools, as you described in your question, that you're supposed to use and others that you're not. And we looked at our original instruction from the government, which is actually very open, our sort of founding document, if you like, which says, you know, we're here to coordinate the innovation ecosystem within Sweden. And then we've led a lot of the work without using much money. And in a funny way, that's not, therefore the bias seems to have shifted in some sense. I'm not pretending that, you know, our projects haven't been colored by vested interests, of course. I mean, the school kids have a vested interest as much as Volvo or Voi, but, you know, we've at least put it in the same mixing pot together, and we haven't led it with financing again. And as soon as we started to say, we want you to come to a session, we're going to work together what to do. And this isn't about financing, because we don't even know what the problem is yet. So how do we know that financing is the answer? You know, perhaps we can actually save a ton of money by using existing healthcare funding and deploying it into streets and food instead. This might actually reduce the amount of money flowing through the system, but in a very positive way. Depends on how we want to frame it, you know. So if we said that we want to frame the question with you together, therefore funding isn't a big deal because we don't know if we need funding yet. That also very much changed the way that the conversation was happening. It felt like people's guard was lowered. They stopped looking at us as national government, and they started seeing us as a collaborator. They put a huge amount of time and effort into that. And we're able to work that through collectively as a co-design process. So I don't want to pretend that that isn't sort of naive in some sense, but it's, you know, it's perhaps naive in the best sense. But it's we're trying to go into that by taking away some of the traditional biases around our work, at least, and then working in a co-design way enables us to position things around the systems as they are, as opposed to the way that power traditionally has been organized.
Thank you very much. I think it would be very interesting to go now to Emma as well, because you work together with extremely varied set of partners. So you must see also in your own organization, but the organizations that you work with, also these kind of different tendencies in play?
Yeah, I think there's two or three things maybe that I would flag. I think, and I'll caveat bias is not a problem that we've solved, but there's a number of things that we are doing which I think help act on it or help us acknowledge what they are. So I think strategically moving from being supply driven to demand driven, but also doing that in a way so we are increasingly focused on working with challenge owners and being very, very careful about how we're defining that. So really, who are the people that own the problems, rather than assuming that organisations or individuals that are sometimes sit as a proxy know the full view, and they are, and also acknowledging that they bring their own, as we all do. Bias is, I think, inescapable to some degree. So really being careful about what we mean by demand-led, what it means to work with a challenge owner, which helps us be, I guess, as Dan was saying, a little bit more open. And so maybe stepping outside our own assumptions, but then also being very careful about understanding when we're talking to influencers and actors and people that hold the power versus people who they may be one and the same, but they are often different in terms of the problem owner or the challenge owner. And being really clear about who you're speaking to, because I think that helps you understand the bias that they're bringing to the situation. I think also allowing space in the portfolio for outliers, things that we didn't think we were going to do earlier in the year, some level of serendipity, the ability to work with unusual actors to ensure that we aren't siloing ourselves into too tight a box, while also making sure that we are working in an orchestrated way and have the ability to achieve impact. And then I think the last thing is we try to bring a diversity of voice to decision making and to sense making. And I think that's great, but it's not enough. So the other thing that we have done alongside that is a lot of capability building and perspective exploring internally, because you can bring diverse people to a table, but then there may also still be an imbalance about which voices get listened to and why. And we are all kind of creatures of and slaves to these things to some degree, but the way we can, I think, work best with them is to build the ability to recognize them and understand that they are there and that they operate. So that's been a really interesting piece of work for me personally. I'm very interested in the change and in the interpersonal and kind of group dynamics element of what we've been doing. So that's one I couldn't resist the temptation to flag. Perfect.
And now I'll turn to Mikael and especially to Sitra as well, because Sitra has had in history of extremely interesting role in the Finnish overall governance system and the innovation system itself. But what do you see as your own, as you said yourself, that Sitra aims to be a facilitator of portfolios in the public sector and public sector towards the systemic changes. But what limits or changes your role within the system?
Yeah, so one thing to understand the positioning of Sitra in the Finnish society is that we're not necessarily only a government agency like maybe here Vinnova is more in Sweden, but we're actually under the Finnish Parliament and the Finnish Bank, and the role that Sitra has in the Finnish society is to be the future fund of Finland. But in addition to the funding, I think we've been transitioning our focus from this type of funder role that Dan was speaking about earlier into this type of more active facilitator of collaboration over the last 10 years or so, or even more. And we always say that Sitra makes its impact in 4 ways. So one is that we highlight new ideas and try to be thought leaders that bring this new thinking and new ways of doing into the Finnish society. And then big part of what we're doing is facilitating these forums for collaboration, which means that we are doing exactly what Emma was saying they're doing at Climate Kick. So how do we create spaces where different parties that not necessarily collaborate with each other together can have good discussions about where to head in the future. And we're also a platform for experimentation And we also do a lot of developing of new activity models and new practices. So generally what we do is we're able to operate over different sectors of the Finnish society. So we're not just talking to government people, but we're bringing them together with municipalities, associations in the private sector, and we look at different types of timescales and time spans. And what I'd say about our portfolio practice is that in Sitra we have really awesome experts. But I think what we're doing right now is we're focusing on improving and building our more maybe rigorous and maybe established practices on how we do this type of societal change and engage with our external stakeholders. And I think that's a lot more about creating these social practices around helping change happen, helping the transformation happen, in addition to doing the funding on the background.
Thank you so much. I've heard from Angela that there are some really great questions in the question and answer section as well. So I'm giving it over to you to give us some questions from the overall audience.
Yes, thank you. And if you'd like to have a question answered, please add it and go through the list of questions and upvote the ones that you want us to ask. We will start from the top. So the way we'll ask questions is we'll have two panelists, the first two to unmute their mic. So that means that you're ready to fire to answer, and then we'll move on to the next question. So of our four panelists, including Pirette. So first question is on power. It's a very popular question. When trying to bring about systems change, how do you deal with the actors or institutions who have power and vested interest in the current systems? I'm going to ask Emma. It looks like you've unmuted your mic. Go ahead.
That was a rookie mistake. I think, I mean, at high level, I think by acknowledging, and by not attempting to bypass, I think they are part of the consortium that you need to build to drive change in most circumstances.
I can add to that a bit.
Yeah, I do. I
mean, fully agree. Would be the short way of adding to that. But I think again we've tried to create this open structure for the projects by locating them not in, let's say, traditional ways agencies might approach their funding streams or their organization, which might be based around, let's say, the motor industry or the forestry industry and so on. You know, that classical model almost, and locating it in reality enables you to do exactly what Emma said, to basically pull multiple people into the same room. By finding an object like the street, you can pull in a major car company and a truck company, as well as a landscape designer and a bunch of school kids, because ultimately that's where they all collide. So we're building the process around the places where those things collide on purpose. And at some point, that's where it has to be threshed out in a democratic place anyway, and someone will win that argument in the short term at least, and that of course plays to power structures, but at least we are doing that in an open way, and at least it's in public, and at least there's a democratic process around it. So if someone wants to say we want to pedestrianize this place and cover it with greenery and bike lanes and Internet of Things sensors, and they've been through the process accordingly, that's the answer. If someone else decides no, it still needs to be parking lots and 400 cars an hour, if that's the democratic process, then fine. But to be super clear, you know, we have our targets. We have to tend one way and not the other. In those two outlines I just talked about, one way tends towards sustainable development goals and the other one doesn't. So we've framed everything. We have the targets, we have the process, we have an open platform and so on. Again, we have to be open to the fact someone might choose parking spaces still at the end of the day, because it's a democracy. But the chances of them doing that are markedly reduced, because we've already decided to go for Paris 1.5 and the SDGs, and we have all of these things in place, and we're engaging many more people in what the answer should be. The previous model let's say the 1960s model was entirely expert driven, and that's where you end up with parking spaces, totally opaque, totally closed process. I'd argue undemocratic in a different way. So at least we're kind of moving to a position where power is part of a process in the way that it perhaps ought to be in a democracy. And we're very aware of where that is, and hence all that talk about supply and demand, about cultural factors as well as technologies, just as Emma said.
Great, thank you. We're moving on to the next question. A portfolio approach depends on effective collaboration, but nearly every large organization complains of silos. Does that mean that successfully using a portfolio approach requires radical organizational change? Perrette, Mikkel, do you want to start us off with answering those?
Sure, I think it's an excellent question. But I think that if you start any process of change by saying, I'm going to radically change your organization by doing it, then you're going to, get the forces against you immediately as well. And I think that some of the practices that we're seeing with that Dan and Kik, that Emma have been talking about as well is, and what Mariana has been noting as the coalition of the willing, that you start by getting together the people or the people in your silos that are actually supporting of the process, and also building up the coalition externally to do so. But of course, it means that if you have a kind of a new mission in place or new societal change in place, then of course it may also mean that organizationally, in time, you have to change your organization to actually work that way as well. But I would say that as Dan has also outlined, that in the beginning, we usually do not know. On the systems projects as well, we don't know what the problems are. So we can't start with an organizational solution for issues that we haven't actually defined. So the kind of the sense making and the problem framing and the portfolio framing should come first with the coalition building, and then we can start talking about organizational change. And of course, you're going to have a lot of, even if an understanding that change is needed, you're going to have a lot of pushback to actually do it.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think being successful in this type of innovation portfolio approach, I think the organizational change frame that we have had previously, that we plan for something and then we implement that Perrette was saying. I think what I was trying to highlight in my presentation was that we actually need a new framing of what is an organization. So rather than looking at it as something static that changes like once every 4 years, you want to focus more on organizing, which means creating the spaces for constant learning and also adapting based on what you are learning. And that's basically the application of the complexity thinking that Dan was referring to earlier. And I think big shift in thinking that helps that implement that is to give the organization the mandate that when you learn something, you are actually able to adapt your processes, your organizations, your networks, your thinking when you learn something new that is founded in experience and stuff that you've already done.
Great.
Can I add briefly, Angela?
Yes, go ahead, Dan.
I'm talking too much, so I don't want to say too much, but I think that we're trying to frame projects as the way you figure out what the organization might be, and projects, missions, programs, whatever. But so as opposed to what as said, like Perrette said, you can't really start with the organization in this way. So with the street thing, in a sense, maybe there's a hunch or an idea there that at some point there's a department of streets, which is this multidisciplinary thing, which involves culture and greenery, as well as traffic, as well as community and retail and so on, and that could work together in that way. I don't want to pretend I can draw that municipal organization now. We have to figure that out in the project effectively, and that's kind of the approach we're taking. Can we use the project to kind of sketch out what the organization is, as opposed to doing it a priori?
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question if the answers are quick. I think it's a good question. What kind of leadership is required for changing to experimentation and portfolio visualization?
Well, I rage against hero leaders all the time. So I think that the answer is, for me, it's that the portfolio approach or innovation approach should be possible under any kind of leadership. You just need to change your action as well. We hear a lot, that unfortunately, in the public sector about the leadership lottery, that I get a leader that is supportive, or I don't get a leader that is not supportive, and everything collapses based on it. I think we need to actually build processes in the public sector where we're not dependent on leaders as much. And also the innovation portfolio approach should be a more inclusive approach, that we're not dependent on kind of these hero leaders coming and going.
And I think there's a new type of leadership emerging. So when you're shifting your focus from this expert leader within an organization, which is a role, to looking at leadership as something that enables transformation, you actually need a lot more leaders who are collaborating to achieve the transformation that you want to achieve. And I think one concept that is being used for that type of leadership is systems leadership. And it's very different than the role-based static leadership, but it's the ability of different type of people within the system to take lead on different type of issues. And that actually helps the whole system achieve different types of outcomes rather than those that have been set by one organization or one team or one project. And I think that's one of the important shifts in leadership as well.
I think definitely from my experience, there is something around more traditional models of leadership which are about an expectation that you are in control of what is happening and that you know the right answer. And I think there's something about leadership quality that's required to work in a slightly different way, and to kind of let go of the assumption that you're going to know the right answer, to let go of the assumption that when the right answer is found, that you should be the person that finds it, giving, I think, space for others and for diversity of perspective. And I think there is a quite a personal or behavioural trait around being able to sit in the uncomfortable uncertainty, and I think that's not to be underestimated in terms of what we ask people to when we ask them to work in different ways and step outside a comfort zone.
Thank you, everyone, all of our panelists, for the great presentations and for the attendees for the really great questions. I'm going to hand it over to Perrette to wrap up and talk about some next steps.
Thank you very much, Angela. I think that a good success, like immediate success of a good webinar, is that you invite people that you want to hear from yourself. So first of all, I'm very glad that Dan, Emma, and Mikael were willing and able to join the webinar on innovation portfolio management and innovation portfolio approaches. So thank you so much for joining and your input. This is such a new and emerging field that I think we will have a lot of learning along the way in the upcoming years. And it would be great to kind of check in once in a while to actually share the learning on these approaches, because we're far from, also at the OECD, from really understanding how different organizations in different contexts can manage their innovation portfolios. Organizations that are very mission or system change oriented, but also organizations in the public sector, for example, who are rather stable but still need an innovation function, and how they can kind of manage these processes in the best way, that they do not have kind of single point interventions or kind of layered approaches on top of each other, but a concerted effort that is in terms of innovation connected to the purpose that they want to achieve. So that's what we want to also help with. So from our side, what are we going to do at the OECD to advance the discussion? We are going to, together with the European Commission, we are going to, by the end of July, we're going to develop the functions of the portfolio assessment tool, module 1 and 2, and put a beta version or a testing prototype up on our website for testing of initial questions and user analysis. That's something that users can actually use and get. We can also get feedback on how that functions. So this is not, this is going to be kind of a snapshot analysis about where your organization is in terms of innovation portfolio analysis. And also we got a lot of thinking from today's webinar about how to think about this mission or system change oriented portfolios that actually go beyond your organization. So how do we have to define your role or these biases as well, that the bias our activity to center on our silos or go beyond that. And the second milestone that the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation has is that we want to also have a kind of functional tool that is useful for our community for government aftershock event that we have planned for November 2020. So have it ready by then for the users to do. So up until then, please join our usability testing that is open until the 31st of May. We have quite a few test samples already and a lot of comments from the community on how to develop that. And hopefully we can also publicize some of these comments about the discussions that we have had around this portfolio assessment tool development itself, because there's a lot of learning in the process itself that has come out by building the model itself. And last but not least, I also to also get involved within the government aftershock event that we have planned for November 17th and 18th of this year, where we are going to have events, challenges, and different hacks across the world at the same time working on public sector innovation, and what basically governments and public sectors will look like after this crisis. And I think that innovation portfolio approaches are going to play a huge role in this, to actually bounce forward from the crisis that we are in now, not just to kind of bounce back to the status quo that we have been having in place all the time. So different public sector organizations also need tools and methods and innovation portfolios to do that effectively. So thank you from all of the Observatory and OECD's team for your time and joining us today at the webinar, and hope to see you soon on our other deep dives and webinars to come. Please send us your comments if you have any to the OECD's OPSI's email, or contact us directly. Thank you so much.